So in this video, we're going to talk about layoffs, some of the layoff trends within the finance industry, and in future videos, I'm going to look into tech, AI, all these other type of trends we see in terms of layoffs. Now, we have layoffs all across, as you probably saw in the thumbnail of this video: Goldman Sachs, PwC, Deutsche Bank, Citi, and Barclays, and so many other banks, right? So let's go through in a bit of detail what's going on here in terms of the layoffs. Here we see Goldman Sachs, who have gone through a cut of their jobs in terms of cutting 1,800 jobs amid the annual review process, which is 3 to 4% of their workforce, as you can see at the top here, of beneath the headlines. That's quite a significant number of people, right? And what they do, and I've worked at Goldman Sachs in the past, if you're new to the channel, essentially what they do is they review their performers, all their employees, they review the performance, and every year get rid of the bottom 3 to 5% essentially, which is quite a few employees. Now, my personal opinion is that's not necessarily the best approach, because it's like you're hiring just to fire them, right? So it seems like a waste of money, and it just doesn't make sense. If I was going to interview people extensively, and when I was interviewing for Goldman Sachs to get my job there, I went through 9 interviews, over 5 hours of interviews, over 3 separate sessions. And when they interview people, they spend so much time doing that. It doesn't make sense to see like someone, oh, they're at the bottom of their performance level after they've been working there for several years, we're going to fire them. It makes sense either to improve them, to work with them, or what's the point of hiring them in the first place if you know you're going to fire a certain percentage of people each year? I don't think that's the most efficient way of doing things. And if we continue to look here, it says, Goldman Sachs is planning to cut almost 1,300 jobs or more as part of their annual review. The job cuts will be around 3 to 4% of their workforce, which would be, as I say, between 1,300 to 1,800 people. And they employ about 45,000 people in total. And the job cuts will be across various decisions, and they're using this type of language, strategic resource assessment, which is just basically performance reviews. And they're talking about their annual review, talent reviews, which are standard and customary, whereby, as I say, they review employees' work and then get rid of the bottom 3 to 5% typically. What's interesting here is when it's talking about the annual culling process, they're looking into many factors, and one factor is in-office attendance. The banks and its peers had relaxed rules during this pandemic, but now they're getting strict on employees to return to the office. So this is like a soft layoff in a sense, or just kind of the ridiculousness of when the system snaps its fingers and wants you to work from home, you have to work from home. Now they snap their fingers and say, oh, we want you to be in the office, so you've got to be in the office. So what ends up happening with a lot of people is maybe they want to work from home, or they get a bit of flexibility approved, but the company's still making a note at the back end behind the scenes where, oh, well, this employee, yeah, maybe they've got some flexibility with us to work from home, which we have to approve as part of local employment concessions that they have to make. For example, in the UK, there's something called reasonable adjustments, where if you work for a company, you can ask for reasonable adjustments, which means you can work from home a few days a week if you justify it in the right way, maybe due to family commitments or mental health type of issues. But otherwise, they'd expect you to be in the office. So that's an interesting factor. If you're out there working a job, you want to stay at the company and you think there could be layoffs next year, take this as a lesson where if you're not working in the office, maybe go back to the office if you want to stay working there, because they're kind of going to be very aggressive with cutting people who try to leverage work from home. Then it says, according to this report, Goldman Sachs reported a 21% increase in investment banking revenue compared to a year ago, 27% increase in asset and wealth management revenue. And it really makes you think how disposable you are as an employee there, because they're making massive increases, 20% and above increases in their revenue, but they're cutting so many jobs. So it's just something to bear in mind when you're working for a company. Don't get too invested, because they do see you as very disposable, and be ready to jump if you're at one of these companies where you think layoffs will be coming up. They're cutting 1,800 jobs also, which is about 2.5% of their global workforce. PwC is one of those big 4 firms in the finance industry, alongside Ernst & Young, KPMG, and Deloitte. So they're cutting 1,800 jobs, and the reason for this is around decline in advisory services, and the operations in the US are going to be significantly impacted by some of these job cuts, and they're going to notify workers in the coming weeks, right? So this is kind of an interesting scenario in terms of to what extent are they cutting jobs. I think it is quite a significant cut of employees, and it's really all about what is going to happen in 2025, because I think there's going to be more of this, and many employees in the past might think, oh, if I lose my job at one of these big four companies, for example, I can move to another, but many of them are not going to be rehiring, right? And if you're at the older age bracket, you might want to think about, are you saving and investing enough for something like this that could impact you? Or long-term unemployment, if you might have a hard time finding your next opportunity. If you're more junior, maybe think about, say, making a jump right now before the job market gets flooded with even more employees who've been subject to a layoff and it's harder to get a job because the competition's so intense for those opportunities available. It's just all about being aware, because obviously when we go into a new year, we try to have a positive mindset, but it is quite rough out there in terms of the job market, so just to be aware of that. And it's an important little point here. It says that the layoffs primarily affect PwC US advisory, product, and tech teams, with nearly half the impacted workers who are also located outside the US. So again, like anything US related, particularly with the economy not doing so well, that's the type of people that will be impacted. So if you're in one of these companies and there's other growth areas, growth markets, that's something you should always pay attention to internally. Which projects are generating the most profit? Which areas of the business are growing, so you might want to move into that department, which particular parts of the world might be growing. So if you're working in a team, even outside the US, that's supporting the US business, you might want to look at, okay, is there another area growing right now, which Asia could be an option for you. So either working in Asia or working in part of your team, wherever you're based, that is supporting the Asia business versus US is something to consider. Next, we're going to look into Deutsche Bank, right? Deutsche Bank's talking about cutting 3,500 jobs over the next 2 years. And it's quite a significant number again, right? There's quite large numbers of employees who are losing their jobs, right? Now, when we look at Deutsche Bank, it says, they're cutting 3,500 jobs worldwide by the end of next year. And if we go to it in a bit of detail, it goes through here. The company employs 7,000 people in the UK, largely in London and Birmingham. And also overall, they have 90,000 employees. Now, one thing about a lot of these big banks, even though they pretend to be private institutions, a lot of them have back ends. They're too big to fail. They have back ends with major governments where they're located. I wouldn't be surprised if Deutsche Bank, even after the bailout, they have connections with government funding that isn't publicly disclosed. Same thing with major banks like Barclays and so on, major US banks, Goldman's and so on. So it's very suspicious to me sometimes when I see them. They have like large hiring patterns in terms of 90,000 employees. A lot of these teams and functions could be defunct, but they just tend to keep them active as it is, almost like it doesn't really impact their profit. So there's two ways of looking at this. Firstly, it's not great, obviously, for people to lose their jobs. But a lot of these big banks, particularly a bank like Deutsche Bank, has a reputation in the finance industry, if you weren't aware, for being so bloated and overemploying people, because they're a bit like a government, an extension of a government entity, essentially. And that's why, they have these 90,000 employees. They're making cuts that maybe they could have made many years ago. And what's interesting here is the type of people who are losing their job. It says here, the announcement means that most of the cuts will be in non-client facing roles. Of course, so that could be operations, marketing, it could be HR, compliance and legal type of roles. So that's something to also bear in mind. Businesses, typically, they're not going to fire a lot of people who are going to generate more revenue for them. But if you're just essentially extra headcount that they need to keep their business functioning, you might be the first up for losing your job. So it's worthwhile considering in terms of your career path where you are right now. If you're more junior, maybe you should look into sales roles. They'll probably be in higher demand because businesses always want to generate more money. If you're in one of the back end roles, think about if you can make a pivot in your career. And it depends on your personal circumstances. I can't really advise you on an individual level here, but it's worthwhile thinking who's actually losing their jobs. And in the case of Deutsche Bank, a lot of it, as I say, will be just support teams, functional departments that actually help the business operate but don't actually generate any money themselves. Next up, we have Citigroup. They're cutting 20,000 jobs, which is quite significant. And it says here, Citigroup will cut 20,000 jobs by the end of 2026. So you're going to continue to see job losses there. So if you work at Citigroup, I'm not saying you should be on edge, but really think about, okay, which part of the business, based on your internal memos, some things that aren't disclosed publicly, which parts are actually growing, right? And it could be, as I say, whether they're location based, maybe you're moving to Asia, moving to Hong Kong office, if the jobs are more stable there and it's growing, or it's simply moving to different projects and teams internally where things are actually growing. If things just seem stagnant, it seems quiet, it seems suspiciously quiet, and you're kind of enjoying getting paid well for not doing much work, it could backfire if you don't make the changes before their restructuring does impact you. And like I said, they're quite open for right now, right? Are we going to have cuts of 20,000 over the next couple of years? So, it's just they're going to keep going with the job cuts, and you never know. You might think your job's safe, your manager says you're good. Next thing you know, you're part of the job cuts. Now, what this chief executive, Jane Fraser, is talking about is a turning point for the American bank. The CFO is talking about how job cuts were tough on morale, as he outlined the planned reductions, right? So again, it's going to impact people's morale because you're always going to be on edge. If you're working there and maybe you need that job, you can't find another opportunity right now, other banks aren't hiring, and on top of that, you've got commitments, family, maybe you're paying for your kids' private school, you're going to pay for an expensive mortgage. And that's why I always advise everyone, it's up to you what you do. This isn't financial advice, but really be careful about those long-term commitments, marriages, mortgages, things like that. Having kids, can you really afford it? Because the thing is, the entire economy is a bubble, right? The entire system, they keep printing money, they keep creating all types of weird dynamics in society. Interest rates go up, banks or businesses are less likely to grow if they've got to borrow at an expensive cost in terms of the interest rate, so they might be focused on cutting jobs and saving money, and you can't control those dynamics. And then if you make a life commitment like, oh, okay, yeah, well, I've got this good job at Citigroup, I'm a managing director at Citigroup, they're not going to cut my job, I'm like an important part of senior or middle management. Next thing you know, you think you're as disposable, and this life you expected to live for many decades until retirement age, with your expensive house and your kids in an expensive private school and your wife, maybe you're paying for her high living costs, things like that, buying expensive handbags and shoes, and all of a sudden your world comes crashing down on you. So many people who think of the totem pole of society, that's not exactly the best approach to take. The way I would approach this society moving forward, at least between now and 2030, when all these agendas might fail or come to fruition, Agenda 2030, 21, things like that, is really be in survival mode. And that doesn't mean be on edge, be in anxiety, think about survival, self-sufficiency and things like that. Now, I'm not saying everyone can own a piece of land and grow their own food, but as much as self-sufficient you can be, whether it's having other income sources, living beneath your means, that's the way you should approach it. You shouldn't be approaching it like I'm a big banker earning a lot of money, because like I say, you could be part of a job cut. So this is what I mean about looking globally at what are the other changes if you're working at a bank like this, or just global trends. So here we have, executives expect the workforce to shrink to about 180,000. Then you've got the bank that they have their Mexican consumer division, which is also going to reduce staff by 40,000 employees at BanMX, right? So that's important to pay attention to, because sometimes we hear these emerging markets, they might be growing, but what's actually going on there? But beneath the surface of this typical narrative that the West is in decline, emerging markets are growing, and here we can see that BanMX, that particular Mexican bank, is reducing staff by 40,000. So it's worthwhile paying attention to that. And then when it talks about the Citi's earnings season got underway, making a 1.8 billion loss, and then after having one-off charges and expenses tied to their restructuring, retreat from Russia, exposure to Argentina, there's so many global changes that have nothing to do with your performance that could be responsible for your layoff. That's why it's always better to plan ahead and, like I say, live beneath your means. Having a 1.8 billion loss, charges and expenses, all these global changes, the Russia business being shut down, being exposed to Argentina, which is volatile in terms of their currency. These are all types of instances that you just are very volatile for you to deal with when you're in the finance industry. At the end of the day, you're just your job that your whole life depends on is just like you're like a line item in an Excel file. You're just a number, you're just a statistic to them, because as you can see here, they're talking about their fourth quarter being quite disappointing in terms of their expenses and things like that. But it also talks about how they talk about simplifying the company and executing their strategy, and how their shares recently went up around 0.4%. They were talking about this. But the point is, like I say, they want to boost profitability, reduce bureaucracy, and increase their stock price, which makes sense from like a shareholder perspective, from a management perspective. But at an individual level, it can be life-changing. If you lose your job at Citigroup and all of a sudden you spend the next 6 months to a year trying to find a job, might have to take a pay cut to get your next opportunity. So it's best to plan ahead now, because 2025 will be the same. And that's what I want to encourage you all to do. When you're planning ahead for your life, particularly going into 2025, just get used to instability, have a stronger mindset, a more resilient mindset, which is a bit of a buzzword in corporate world, but having a more stronger self-sufficient mindset, that's the best way I can put it, where you realize no one's actually looking out for your best interest, not the company you work for, the community you're in many cases, the government that apparently meant to use your tax money wisely. You're kind of on your own, and you have to be able to navigate this very unstable dynamic as best you can. And then lastly, I want to talk about Barclays Bank that are cutting 5,000 jobs. So it's another high number. They're looking at cost cutting. And then if you go into a bit of detail about what they're talking about, they're saying, okay, they're cutting 5,000 jobs from their global workforce. Again, a very big bank, 84,000 people hired globally, simplifying and reshaping their business. And, it talks about this Barclays spokesperson that says they're going to support their affected employees with training advice, depending on where they're based. So that's something to take advantage of. Sometimes if you're told you have a layoff, sometimes they do have good career coaching services, might help you pivot your career, many free career coaching services with an external third-party vendor. They might review your CV, put you in touch with some good recruiters to find your next opportunity. So it's worthwhile kind of planning ahead for these type of instances so you don't get caught up and exploiting any of the resource status you do have in that layoff. So for example, maybe in your last 3 months at a company, you're told about a layoff and that you're going to have your health care benefits over the next few months. If you want to spend that time using it for mental health therapy, to look out for your kids or your wife in terms of any healthcare expenses they might have if you have a company healthcare plan, just make sure you exploit all of that in your last couple months there if you are part of a layoff. Next, it says that the reduction in headcount is possibly due to redundancies as well as vacancies that haven't been filled during a hiring freeze, which is essentially you had open positions that people haven't been able to fulfill, and then there was a hiring freeze. And this is the difficult reality that when you have layoffs at other companies, you might think, well, other banks are hiring. Oh, if you get laid off from Citigroup, maybe you can go work at Barclays. But if you go to work at Barclays, then all of a sudden you find out that they're not hiring anymore for positions that were previously open. Then you're in a difficult position, potentially facing longer term unemployment. Here it says that most employees affected work in back office support teams. Again, if you're not generating money for a company, they're going to see you as an expense they can get rid of, particularly when they can, as they're mentioning here, looking at improving technology, more automation, which is a bit of a buzzword, but many people who would just have support roles, they're getting offshored to or outsourced to India, countries like that. Less and less opportunities for some of those support teams, or they move to a cheaper city. They're going to, even within a country, they move a lot of these jobs, say from London to Birmingham to other low cost of living areas that companies don't want to have to pay high wages for. And then here it also announces that Barclays are closing 200 branches in recent years, right? And only 10% of transactions are taking face-to-face. Most people are using internet banking and things like that. So many jobs are being lost in the retail banking sector. Now, when we put together all these particular statistics, Barclays cutting 5,000 jobs, Citigroup cutting 20,000 jobs, Deutsche Bank cutting 3,500 jobs, PwC cutting 1,800 jobs, and Goldman Sachs cutting about 1,800 jobs also. It really does make you think about the direction of the industry in general. I've worked in the finance industry for over a decade. There's always been a sense of decline there, even though you might hear high profits here and there. In terms of hiring patterns, they're actually hiring less and less. It's always shrinking. They always need less people, but supposedly what's the contrast with that is how many people do work at some of these big banks because they're quite inefficient, who don't seem to be doing much work. So it's kind of a weird mixed bag. But the general trend is less hiring, more layoffs, and just being able to plan ahead of that. Like I say, some of the strategies I mentioned earlier in the video, be aware of that. Don't be overly optimistic. Maybe you're happy about the presidency in America. You think business is going to be booming in 2025. It might not be to the same extent that you think it will be. You might be moving into a new job right now, thinking it's going to be all rosy, and then a year later, you're part of a layoff. I've seen that happen to people. So much is kind of out of your control, and that's why you should do the best to control what you can. Say whether it's living way below your means or developing new skills that mean you can work in growing areas, whether that's fintech, working in different locations, being less attached being to where you live, and being hyper flexible. That's the kind of survival strategy you need in this type of upside down society now. I've worked in the finance industry for over 10 years, top investment banks, sales and trading roles, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and many other banks. I offer a career advice service. There's a link in the description if you want to speak with me directly. Let me know in the comments, so you're worried about 2025 and potential layoffs there for yourself. What are your plans? How do you plan to move forward? 2 recommended videos on the screen right now, and I'll see you next time.